The parking lot was quiet that afternoon, with the faint rustle of leaves and distant chatter breaking the silence. An elderly black man, carrying a small bag of groceries, walked toward his car, unaware that his ordinary day was about to take a terrifying turn. As he approached his vehicle, the sound of raised voices caught his attention. A disagreement over a parking space had escalated nearby, but he paid little notice. These things happened all the time. Then, without warning, the sharp, chilling click of a gun being cocked shattered the calm. He froze in his tracks, his heart pounding as he turned to see the source of the sound. There stood a police officer, his weapon drawn, aimed directly at the man. The argument had turned into something far more dangerous, and the elderly man, unarmed and vulnerable, became the target of unwarranted aggression. Witnesses looked on, some frozen in shock, others hurriedly pulling out their phones to record the unfolding scene. In that moment, the parking lot transformed into a stage for a grim reminder of the realities faced by many. A moment that encapsulated the fragility of trust, the power of authority, and the stark divide between those meant to protect and those left to fear them. This story is not just about what happened in that parking lot. It's about what it represents. Racial profiling, the misuse of force, and the erosion of public trust in law enforcement. The officer's actions led to his dismissal, but the damage, emotional, social, and systemic, had already been done. This incident is a painful reflection of deeper issues within the system, highlighting why accountability and change are desperately needed. In this video, we'll delve into the events that unfolded, the consequences that followed, and the lessons we must learn to ensure incidents like this never happen again. This isn't just one man's story. It's a story that belongs to all of us, and it demands our attention. It all began with a misunderstanding over a parking space. The elderly black man had just returned from the store, placing his groceries in the trunk of his car, when a heated exchange erupted nearby. Another vehicle, attempting to back into the adjacent spot, nearly grazed his parked car. Voices were raised. First the driver of the second car, then the elderly man trying to explain himself. Witnesses described the argument as tense, but not unusual. As the exchange continued, a police officer arrived, called by someone who thought the situation might get out of hand. Instead of calming things down, the officer approached with an air of authority that quickly escalated the scene. Witnesses said the officer demanded that the elderly man step back while ignoring his explanations. What happened next stunned everyone. As the officer's voice grew louder, his hand moved toward his holster. The elderly man, visibly confused, raised his hand slightly, as if to de-escalate the situation himself. But it was too late. The officer drew his gun, pointing it directly at the man. Gasps echoed across the parking lot. A woman shouted, "He's unarmed," as others scrambled to pull out their phones and record the moment. The silence that followed was deafening. The elderly man stood frozen, his groceries scattered on the ground, his hands trembling in the air. For the elderly man, this wasn't just about a parking space. It was a moment that reflected a lifetime of navigating the world as a black man, aware of the unspoken biases that could turn even the simplest interactions into dangerous confrontations. Witnesses later described the officer's aggressive tone and immediate suspicion as disproportionate, noting how quickly he directed his attention to the elderly man while largely ignoring the other party involved in the dispute. Statistics back up what many in the community already felt. Black individuals are disproportionately subjected to police stops, searches, and use of force. Studies show that black men are nearly 3 times more likely to face police violence than their white counterparts in similar situations. Historical cases, from routine traffic stops to incidents of mistaken identity, reveal a troubling pattern of racial profiling and excessive force that continues to erode trust in law enforcement. For the elderly man, the fear wasn't just about the gun pointed at him. It was about the countless times he had been treated with suspicion, the stories of others like him who didn't survive such encounters, and the knowledge that his age or vulnerability might not matter in the face of prejudice. The scene in the parking lot erupted after the incident. As the officer kept his gun trained on the man, a crowd began to gather. Shouts of anger and disbelief filled the air. Some pleaded with the officer to lower his weapon, while others berated him for what they saw as an obvious abuse of power. When backup arrived, the situation finally began to de-escalate. The elderly man was allowed to leave, but the emotional scars were already deep. Witnesses described him as shaken, his hands trembling as he picked up his scattered groceries. A bystander offered to drive him home, sensing he was too distraught to get behind the wheel himself. The officer's actions sparked immediate outrage, both in the parking lot and online. Videos of the confrontation quickly went viral, drawing criticism from civil rights groups and public figures alike. For the elderly man's family, the incident was a devastating reminder of the dangers he faced simply because of his race. His granddaughter later spoke to reporters, her voice breaking as she described how her grandfather couldn't stop reliving the moment. "He keeps saying, 'I thought that was it. I thought my life was over,'" she said. The officer was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, but the damage had already been done. The incident wasn't just about one man or one gun. It was about the deep cracks in a system that allowed such confrontations to occur in the first place. For the elderly man, his family, and the witnesses who watched in horror, the parking lot became a symbol of how much work remains to be done to address racial bias, police accountability, and the fragile state of public trust in law enforcement. The critical question surrounding this incident is, was the officer's response justified? At the heart of the controversy lies the split-second decision to draw a firearm, a choice that not only escalated the situation, but also put an unarmed elderly man at immediate risk. Experts argue that the officer's response was wildly disproportionate. The confrontation stemmed from a minor parking dispute, which posed no physical threat to anyone involved. Instead of diffusing the situation, the officer's actions heightened the tension, leaving witnesses stunned and the elderly man fearing for his life. De-escalation techniques, such as verbal mediation or a calming presence, could have been effective here. According to law enforcement protocols, officers are trained to prioritize communication and situational control without resorting to force unless absolutely necessary. In this case, the elderly man was visibly unarmed and cooperative, his hands raised as he tried to explain himself. There was no immediate danger, no weapon present, and no resistance. Critics have pointed out that the officer not only ignored standard practices, but actively escalated the situation, turning a routine disagreement into a life-threatening confrontation. Standard law enforcement protocols are clear. Force should be used only when there is a credible threat to the officer or public safety. This incident, by all accounts, did not meet those criteria. The decision to draw a gun on an elderly, unarmed man raises troubling questions about judgment and accountability. Was the officer responding to the man's race or demeanor rather than the facts of the situation? Could implicit bias have clouded the officer's perception of threat? These questions lie at the center of the ongoing investigation. Incidents like this bring into focus glaring gaps in police training. One of the key issues highlighted by experts is the lack of effective de-escalation training. Officers are often placed in high-pressure situations, but without the right tools to navigate them calmly, those situations can spiral out of control. In this case, the officer could have used verbal techniques to diffuse the disagreement instead of resorting to intimidation. Programs that emphasize de-escalation have proven to significantly reduce the use of force, yet many departments fail to make such training mandatory or comprehensive. Implicit bias training is another critical area where law enforcement agencies often fall short. Biases, both conscious and unconscious, can heavily influence an officer's perception of threat. The elderly man in this case was unarmed, cooperative, and visibly no threat, yet the officer's reaction suggested otherwise. Without proper training to recognize and address these biases, such incidents are likely to occur again. This brings us to an important question. Was this incident the result of inadequate training or personal misconduct? Some argue that no amount of training could prevent an officer with poor judgment or discriminatory tendencies from abusing their power. However, others believe that systemic reform in training protocols, particularly those that focus on de-escalation and bias awareness, could prevent similar incidents in the future. The officer's actions during this incident were partially recorded on body cam footage, a critical piece of evidence that has since been reviewed by investigators. Body cam footage provides an unfiltered view of the events, capturing both the officer's demeanor and the elderly man's reaction. According to initial reports, the footage clearly shows the elderly man complying with the officer's commands, raising his hands and remaining still as the gun was pointed at him. This directly contradicts the officer's claim that the man was behaving aggressively. Witness accounts further corroborate the footage. Several bystanders described the elderly man as calm and cooperative, with one saying, "He looked terrified, not threatening." Another witness emphasized how quickly the officer escalated the situation, stating, "The gun was out before anyone even knew what was happening." These statements paint a picture of an incident where the officer's actions were neither necessary nor justified. Technology, like body cams, has become a powerful tool for accountability, providing clear evidence in cases of alleged misconduct. However, this incident also highlights the limitations of relying solely on technology. While the footage captures the immediate confrontation, it doesn't fully reveal the officer's mindset or the implicit biases that may have influenced his actions. Moreover, body cams alone cannot prevent these incidents. They can only document them after they occur. The combination of body cam footage and witness testimony has painted a damning picture of the officer's behavior, leading to his dismissal. However, the broader questions remain. How did someone with this judgment make it through training? What systemic failures allowed this incident to happen? These are the questions that the investigation and society at large must grapple with to prevent future tragedies. The moment the incident was reported, the police department launched an internal investigation. Body cam footage became the cornerstone of their review, providing an unfiltered record of the confrontation. In the video, the elderly man is seen complying with the officer's commands, his hands raised, his voice calm. Witness testimony echoed this account, with multiple bystanders describing the officer's reaction as excessive and unprovoked. The officer, when questioned, maintained that he felt threatened, a justification that fell apart upon review of the evidence. Internal investigators noted several violations of standard protocols, particularly the decision to escalate to deadly force without any visible threat. One investigator remarked, "The officer's actions were not only inconsistent with training but also with basic principles. Civil suits, while not criminal, have been pivotal in holding officers and departments accountable when criminal charges fall short. Legal frameworks governing police misconduct remain a gray area in many jurisdictions. Qualified immunity, a legal doctrine protecting officers from personal liability, may come into play. Activists and legal experts have long criticized this doctrine, arguing that it shields officers from accountability in cases like this one. Whether this case leads to changes in those laws remains to be seen." News of the incident spread like wildfire, fueled by viral videos shared on social media. The footage of the officer pointing his gun at the trembling elderly man ignited a wave of outrage. Hashtags calling for justice trended within hours, with calls for accountability echoing from every corner of the internet. Community leaders and activists quickly took to the streets, organizing rallies and demanding reform. One community leader stated, "This isn't an isolated incident, it's part of a pattern. We've seen too many moments like this, and it has to stop." Protests outside the police department drew hundreds, with demonstrators holding signs reading "Protect, Don't Profile" and "Justice for All." Activists also highlighted the racial undertones of the incident, linking it to a long history of disproportionate policing in Black communities. The image of an unarmed Black man, elderly and defenseless, facing the barrel of a gun, became a stark symbol of systemic injustice. The case reignited conversations about racial bias in policing and the urgent need for structural reforms. The backlash wasn't confined to the streets. Public officials and lawmakers weighed in, with some calling for an independent review of the department's practices. Social media amplified these demands, turning a local incident into a national debate. While some applauded the department's swift response, others argued that firing the officer was not enough. Accountability doesn't stop at firing. It means real justice, one activist declared during a televised interview. The backlash underscored a larger demand for change, not just in this department but in law enforcement as a whole. As the legal process unfolds, the public continues to watch closely, demanding transparency, justice, and a system that works for everyone. Holding police officers accountable has long been a challenge, especially in cases involving misconduct or excessive force. Internal investigations, while a necessary step, often face criticism for lacking transparency and independence. Officers are frequently investigated by colleagues or supervisors within the same department, leading to perceptions or realities of bias. The result? Many cases end with minimal consequences, even in instances where public trust has been visibly eroded. Independent oversight bodies have been a focal point in the fight for accountability. These organizations, often made up of civilians, legal experts, and independent investigators, offer a critical layer of impartiality. When such bodies are empowered to review cases, they provide transparency and build public confidence in the outcomes. Yet, these oversight mechanisms are not universal, and their authority varies greatly. In this case, while the officer was fired swiftly, advocates argue that an independent body would ensure the investigation's fairness and impartiality, particularly given the racial dynamics at play. Accountability isn't just about punishing individual officers. It's about creating systems that prevent misconduct from happening in the first place. Oversight, when done right, forces departments to confront systemic flaws, ensuring they prioritize prevention over reaction. This incident is a glaring example of the structural issues that perpetuate racial bias in law enforcement. Decades of research have shown that Black individuals are more likely to experience excessive force, racial profiling, and unwarranted stops compared to their white counterparts. The elderly man in this case became another statistic in a troubling pattern that has persisted for far too long. Data paints a clear picture. Black men are nearly 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white men, and they are disproportionately targeted for stops and searches, even in areas where they make up a minority of the population. These disparities aren't random. They're the product of systemic policies and practices that have reinforced bias over generations. Structural racism in policing can also be traced to hiring practices, inadequate training, and the lack of diversity within many departments. Without addressing these root causes, incidents like this will continue to occur. Programs aimed at reducing racial bias, such as implicit bias training, are a step in the right direction, but they often fall short due to insufficient funding, weak implementation, or resistance within departments. The elderly man's experience in the parking lot highlights the psychological toll of these disparities. For him and countless others, the fear of being unfairly targeted by police isn't hypothetical. It's a lived reality. His story underscores the urgent need for systemic reforms that address racial disparities at every level of law enforcement. Incidents like this have a profound impact on public trust in law enforcement, particularly in communities of color. Trust is the cornerstone of effective policing, yet it has been eroded by a long history of racial bias, misconduct, and lack of accountability. The image of an unarmed, elderly Black man facing the barrel of a police officer's gun is a stark reminder of the power imbalance that many feel when interacting with law enforcement. When people no longer trust the police to protect them, it creates a ripple effect. Communities are less likely to report crimes, cooperate with investigations, or view officers as allies. Instead, they see them as adversaries, a dynamic that harms both citizens and officers. This erosion of trust extends beyond those directly affected, spreading to witnesses, friends, families, and the broader public. Incidents like these also fuel anti-police sentiment, amplifying calls to defund or reform law enforcement agencies. While some argue that such sentiments are counterproductive, they are a natural response to repeated instances of misconduct. Every viral video, every shocking headline, becomes another brick in the wall separating police from the people they are meant to serve. Rebuilding trust requires more than apologies or individual firings. It demands structural change. Departments must demonstrate a genuine commitment to accountability, equity, and transparency. Until they do, trust will remain fragile, and the divide between police and communities of color will only grow wider. The heart of this case lies in the officer's decision to draw his weapon during a routine parking lot dispute. It raises a critical question. When is it appropriate for officers to use force? And how can we ensure they exercise restraint in non-threatening situations? Use of force policies are meant to provide clear guidelines, but in many departments, these policies are vague or inconsistently enforced. Officers often have broad discretion to decide what constitutes a threat, a judgment that can be influenced by bias, stress, or poor training. This incident highlights the need for more precise protocols, including mandatory de-escalation techniques and strict criteria for drawing weapons. Departments must also implement better training programs that focus on non-lethal alternatives. Situational training that mimics real-life scenarios can prepare officers to handle tense situations without resorting to force. De-escalation training, in particular, has been shown to significantly reduce the likelihood of violence, yet it remains underutilized in many departments. Accountability is another key component of reform. Officers must know that their actions will be scrutinized and that violations of use of force policies will result in meaningful consequences. Without this accountability, policies are little more than words on paper. Finally, community involvement is crucial. Departments should work with local communities to develop use of force policies that reflect their values and concerns. By involving the people most affected by policing, departments can create policies that are both effective and equitable. The parking lot incident is a stark reminder of the urgent need to revisit and reform use of force policies. It's not enough to address individual cases of misconduct. We must address the systemic issues that allow such misconduct to occur. Only then can we begin to rebuild trust, reduce harm, and create a system of policing that truly serves and protects all communities. The incident didn't just leave the elderly man shaken. It sent ripples of shock and outrage through his family and the broader community. His granddaughter, visibly emotional during a press conference, described the lasting trauma her grandfather experienced. "He can't stop talking about it," she said, her voice trembling. "He told me, I thought I wasn't going to make it home that day." No one should ever feel that way, especially over something so trivial. The family expressed gratitude for the community's support, but emphasized the need for accountability and change to ensure no one else endures what their loved one went through. Community leaders quickly rallied behind the family, organizing vigils and public forums to discuss the broader implications of the incident. "This isn't just about one man," said a local pastor. "It's about every Black man, woman, and child who lives with the fear that a simple misunderstanding could cost them their life." These forums became a platform for residents to share their own experiences with racial bias in policing, painting a picture of a community deeply scarred by mistrust and systemic inequality. One community leader summed up the sentiment poignantly: We're not just fighting for justice for him, we're fighting for justice for all of us. This is our reality, and it has to change. Law enforcement professionals weighed in on the officer's actions, offering mixed perspectives. While many condemned the decision to escalate a minor parking lot dispute into a life-threatening confrontation, others pointed to the need for better training and support for officers. This was a failure on multiple levels, said a retired police chief. The officer's judgment was flawed and his actions were completely out of line. But we also have to ask, was he given the tools and training to handle this situation appropriately? Suggestions from law enforcement experts focused heavily on de-escalation training and accountability measures. De-escalation isn't just a buzzword, it's a skill, said a former academy trainer. If officers don't learn how to diffuse tension, they'll keep relying on force as their first option. And that's a recipe for disaster. Legal experts also chimed in, highlighting the systemic issues that enable such incidents. This isn't just about one bad apple, said a civil rights attorney. This is about a system that allows officers to act with impunity, especially when the victim is Black. Until we address the structural racism baked into law enforcement policies, we're going to keep seeing stories like this. One key area of focus was qualified immunity, a legal doctrine that often shields officers from accountability. Experts argued that reforms to this doctrine could make it easier for victims of police misconduct to seek justice. If officers know they can't hide behind qualified immunity, they'll think twice before pulling a gun in a situation like this, the attorney added. The viral video of the incident played a pivotal role in bringing the story to the forefront of public discourse. Within hours of being uploaded, it had been shared thousands of times across social media platforms, sparking outrage and calls for justice. The footage, showing the elderly man trembling with his hands raised as the officer aimed a gun at him, became a symbol of systemic injustice. The power of the video cannot be overstated, said a media studies professor. It forced people to confront the reality of what happened. Without that footage, this might have been another story buried in the system. Viral videos have become a double-edged sword in cases like these. On one hand, they amplify awareness and demand accountability. On the other, they often reduce complex issues to a few minutes of raw footage, leaving out context and nuance. Media coverage also plays a crucial role in shaping public perception. Some outlets framed the incident as an isolated case of a bad cop, while others delved into the systemic issues of racial bias and excessive force. The difference in framing influenced how audiences interpreted the story, whether they saw it as a one-off tragedy or part of a broader pattern of injustice. Social media, in particular, became a battleground for public opinion. Activists used platforms like Twitter and Instagram to organize protests, share personal stories, and push for systemic reforms. At the same time, critics of the officer's actions faced backlash from those who argued that the media was unfairly demonizing law enforcement. Ultimately, the media's role extended beyond reporting the incident. It became a catalyst for change. The footage galvanized public demand for accountability, amplified the voices of the victim's family and community, and reignited debates about policing in America. One of the most critical steps in preventing incidents like this is tackling implicit bias within law enforcement. Police officers, like anyone else, are influenced by subconscious biases that shape their perceptions and decisions. When left unaddressed, these biases can lead to unjustified use of force, particularly against marginalized groups. Mandatory implicit bias training for officers is essential. These programs help officers recognize and mitigate their biases, improving their ability to assess situations fairly and objectively. Community policing initiatives are another powerful tool to reduce racial tensions. When officers build relationships with the communities they serve, they are more likely to see residents as individuals rather than stereotypes. Programs that encourage officers to engage with community members through outreach events, neighborhood patrols, and mentorship initiatives can foster trust and understanding. By breaking down barriers, community policing creates an environment where both officers and residents feel safer. Effective de-escalation training could have drastically changed the outcome of this incident. By teaching officers how to calm tense situations without resorting to force, departments can prevent unnecessary confrontations. Training should incorporate real-life scenarios that mimic high-stress situations, allowing officers to practice communication, empathy, and conflict resolution in a controlled environment. Case studies of successful de-escalation techniques provide valuable lessons. For example, a program in Seattle reduced use of force incidents by training officers to focus on verbal strategies, active listening, and maintaining non-threatening body language. In one instance, officers resolved a domestic disturbance by using empathy and communication rather than physical intervention, resulting in a peaceful resolution. Such examples underscore the importance of equipping officers with practical tools for de-escalation. Making de-escalation training a standard and recurring part of law enforcement education ensures that officers are prepared to handle even the most challenging situations with professionalism and restraint. Accountability is the backbone of effective policing. To prevent incidents like this, departments must implement stronger mechanisms to monitor and address officer conduct. Body cameras, for instance, are invaluable for providing an objective record of interactions. However, their effectiveness depends on strict policies governing their use. Officers should be required to keep cameras on during all interactions, with severe consequences for failing to do so. Oversight committees should regularly review body cam footage to identify patterns of misconduct and areas for improvement. Encouraging whistleblowing is another crucial step. Officers who witness misconduct should feel empowered to report it without fear of retaliation. Whistleblower protection policies and anonymous reporting systems can ensure that officers feel safe speaking out against colleagues who violate department protocols. Independent reviews of critical incidents are equally important. Internal investigations often lack transparency, leading to public distrust. By involving independent investigators or civilian oversight boards, departments can ensure unbiased evaluations and rebuild community confidence. Ultimately, preventing incidents like this requires a collaborative approach between police departments and the communities they serve. Open communication is key. Departments should regularly host town hall meetings, listening sessions, and forums where community members can voice their concerns and share their experiences. These events provide valuable insights into how residents perceive law enforcement and what changes they want to see. Workshops that bring officers and community members together can also help bridge the divide. For example, programs that allow residents to participate in police training simulations and officers to attend community-organized events can foster mutual understanding. These interactions humanize both sides, reducing hostility and promoting empathy. Another innovative approach is the establishment of community advisory boards. These boards, composed of local residents, activists, and department representatives, can serve as a liaison between police and the public. By providing input on policies, reviewing complaints, and suggesting reforms, advisory boards ensure that community voices are heard and respected. The parking lot incident was more than just a confrontation between an elderly black man and a police officer. It became a reflection of deep-seated issues within law enforcement and society at large. What began as a minor dispute over a parking space escalated into a life-threatening moment, leaving a man traumatized, a community outraged, and a department scrambling to regain trust. The officer's termination was a necessary step, but it highlighted broader implications: the prevalence of racial bias, the misuse of force, and the fragile relationship between police and the communities they are sworn to serve. At its core, this incident exposed the systemic flaws in policing that allow such situations to occur. From inadequate de-escalation training to unchecked implicit bias, The cracks in the system are glaring. This wasn't just one officer's failure, it was a failure of the structures and policies meant to ensure justice and accountability. The emotional and societal aftermath of this event serves as a painful reminder of the urgent need for reform. Change is not optional, it is imperative. Preventing future incidents requires systemic action on multiple fronts. Police departments must prioritize comprehensive training that focuses on de-escalation and addressing implicit biases. Independent oversight bodies must be established to ensure transparency and accountability. Communities must be given a voice in shaping the policies that affect them. And legal protections like qualified immunity must be revisited to hold officers accountable for misconduct. This isn't just about changing policies. It's about shifting the culture of law enforcement. Officers must be equipped not only with the tools to protect, but also with the empathy and understanding to serve. The elderly man in this story deserved better. His community deserved better. And so does every individual who fears becoming the next victim of systemic failure. Building a safer and more just society starts with rebuilding trust. That trust can only be earned through accountability, transparency, and genuine engagement with the communities most affected by policing. Every viral video, every headline, and every outcry is a reminder that the status quo is not acceptable. But it's also a call to action, a chance to confront these issues head-on and create lasting change. The lessons from this incident are clear. Policing must evolve to meet the needs of a diverse and equitable society. It's a challenging road, but one worth traveling. Because justice isn't just about holding one officer accountable. It's about transforming a system to ensure that no one else has to endure the fear, trauma, and injustice that this elderly man faced in that parking lot. This moment is an opportunity to demand more, to do better, and to move closer to a world where safety, fairness, and trust are not privileges, they are rights for everyone. The question now is, will we rise to the challenge? The answer will define our path forward.